For centuries, the sound of massed cavalry was the sound of impending doom. The ground would tremble. A line of lances and sabers would appear on the horizon. And then, a wall of horseflesh and steel would descend in a furious, unstoppable tide. It was shock and awe, medieval style. And no one had mastered this terrifying art of war quite like the Germans. But in the span of a single, bloody generation, that thousand-year reign would end. Not with a bang, but with the crisp, mechanical crack of a bolt-action rifle. This is the story of the rise, the zenith, and the brutal, technological downfall of the German cavalry. Our story doesn't begin in the mud of Flanders, but on the sweeping plains of a vanishing age. The legacy was deep. From the Teutonic knights of the Middle Ages to the vaunted Schwerer Reiter, the heavy cavalry of the Holy Roman Empire, German horsemen were famed for their discipline, their shock power, and their sheer, intimidating presence. By the 19th century, this tradition was crystallized in the armies of Prussia. The cavalry wasn't just another branch, it was the aristocracy of the army. Young nobles, like a young Otto von Bismarck, learned their trade in its elite regiments. Their spirit was captured in the hurrah, charge, a thundering, full-gallop assault meant to break an enemy line through sheer psychological terror. And it worked. In the War of 1866, against Austria, Prussian cavalry proved decisive. At the Battle of Königgrätz, as masses of infantry grappled in a colossal struggle, it was the timely charge of the Prussian First Guards dragoons that shattered the Austrian flank, turning a hard-fought battle into a rout. The horse was king, the saber was queen, but a shadow was creeping onto the battlefield, a new invention, the breech-loading needle gun. For the first time, infantry could fire lying down and reload with stunning speed. The Prussians had it. Their enemies did not. At Königgrätz, Austrian cavalry charges against Prussian infantry equipped with these guns were cut to pieces. The warning shot had been fired, but few in the proud cavalry arm truly listened. The pinnacle of the old way came in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and it was here that German cavalry wrote its most legendary chapter. The French army, defeated at Sedan, was in tatters. The emperor was captured, but the war wasn't over. A new French Republic government vowed to fight on, and a massive new army was forming near Paris. The commander of the Prussian forces, Helmuth von Moltke, had a problem. He was deep in enemy territory. He knew a large French force was out there, somewhere, but his scouts, limited to hilltops and church towers, were blind. He needed eyes, and so he unleashed his cavalry in a way never seen before. Not as a single hammer blow, but as a spreading net. Regiment after regiment of Prussian Uhlans, lancers in distinctive Seezapka helmets, and hussars fanned out across the French countryside in a massive strategic reconnaissance. They moved in squadrons, covering dozens of miles a day, probing, skirmishing, and reporting back. Their mission, find the new French army of the north, and on October 7, 1870, they found it. Near the town of Attigny, a patrol of the First Guards dragoons spotted vast columns of French troops, over 60,000 men, marching south. The intelligence was gold. It was promptly rushed up the chain to Moltke, but the French commander, General Louis Faidherbe, knew he'd been seen. He had to move fast. He ordered a forced march, hoping to slip away and strike where the Prussians least expected. For days, a desperate cat-and-mouse game played out across the plains of northern France. Prussian cavalry clung to the French flanks like shadows, sending a constant stream of updates. Every time Faidherbe tried to change direction, a new screen of Uhlans would appear on the horizon, their lances tiny black slivers against the sky. Because of the cavalry, Moltke always knew the French army's position, strength, and direction. He was able to maneuver his own infantry into the perfect blocking position. The two armies finally collided at the Battle of Amiens, and here, the cavalry did what it did best. As the Prussian infantry locked the French in a brutal firefight, the order was given. Trumpets sounded, sabers were drawn from their scabbards with a metallic hiss, and the entire 4th Cavalry Brigade launched a sweeping charge into the French rear and artillery positions. It was chaos. Supply wagons overturned. Gun crews were sabered where they stood. The French line of communication was severed. The battle, already hard-fought, was now a decisive Prussian victory. The French army of the north was broken, and the path to Paris was secured. The German cavalry had not just participated in the victory, it had engineered it. From reconnaissance to the decisive charge, it was the complete, perfect demonstration of cavalry's power in the modern age. In 1871, as the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the cavalry officers stood tall. They were the heirs of Blücher, the heroes of Sedan and Amiens. Their value was unquestionable, their future secure. But in the weapons factories of Mauser, and in the minds of tacticians observing distant conflicts in America and South Africa, the seeds of their destruction were being sown. A new rifle was coming. One that could fire farther, faster, and with more accuracy than anything that had come before. And when it reached the hands of every common infantryman, the great age of the charge would meet its end in a storm of lead. The new century dawned. And with it, the weapon that would forever change the calculus of war. It wasn't a cannon or a machine gun. It was the humble infantry rifle, perfected. The Mauser Gehör 98. In the hands of a trained soldier, it was an instrument of terrifying efficiency, accurate to over 500 meters, fed by a 5-round stripper clip, allowing a rapid, murderous rate of fire. Every common foot soldier now held a piece of technology that could kill a man a kilometer away. This was the storm into which the proud German cavalry rode in August of 1914. The war began with the last great gasp of the Old World. As the German armies swept through Belgium and France in the Schlieffen Plan, the cavalry divisions were at the tip of the spear. Their mission was familiar: screen the advance, probe for weaknesses, and exploit breakthroughs. They expected another war of movement, another Amiens. The first encounters were brutal and instructional. At the Battle of the Frontiers, German cuirassiers and Uhlans, resplendent in their polished breastplates and lances, charged French and British positions. They were met by disciplined volleys from Lee-Enfields and Lebel rifles. The results were catastrophic. Horses and men fell in tangled, screaming heaps. A charge that once would have broken a line now shattered against it. The battlefield had become a killing zone, and the range of that zone had expanded by hundreds of yards. But the death of the cavalry was not just a story of brave, foolish charges into machine guns. It was a slower, more insidious strangulation of its very purpose. Consider the landscape. The Western Front, from the Swiss border to the North Sea, became a continuous, tangled scar of trenches, bounded by vast fields of barbed wire. This was terrain no horse could traverse. The empty land between the trenches, no man's land, was a barren, cratered waste, swept by interlocking fields of fire from rifles, machine guns, and rapid-firing artillery. There was no flank to ride around, no open rear to charge into. The war of maneuver was dead. So what was a cavalryman to do? The high command, steeped in tradition, kept them waiting. Masses of men and horses were held in reserve for years, consuming vast quantities of fodder and supplies. Waiting for der Tag, the day when the great breakthrough would come and they could pour through the gap. That day came at enormous cost in the spring of 1918. After years of stalemate, Germany launched its last great gamble, the Kaiserschlacht, the spring offensive. Using new infiltration tactics, Sturmtruppen bypassing strongpoints, they smashed through Allied lines. For the first time since 1914, the front was fluid. Open ground appeared. This was it. The moment the cavalry had been preserved for. At Villers-Bretonneux and other points of the breakthrough, German cavalry divisions were ordered forward to exploit the success, to turn a tactical victory into a strategic rout. They rode into a battlefield utterly transformed. The open ground was a shell-pocked quagmire, littered with the debris of war and crisscrossed with old, shattered trench lines. They were not charging disorganized infantry, but hastily established strongpoints of Lewis guns and rallied infantry, armed with those same, deadly modern rifles. And then they met the true heir to their throne of shock, the tank. At the Second Battle of the Marne, British and French tanks clanked into the fray. Against these steel beasts, the saber was a toothpick, the horse a fragile living thing. But the most telling and tragic symbol of this changing of the guard occurred in the air, and in the minds of men. The ultimate eyes of the army were no longer scouts on horseback, but reconnaissance biplanes like the Rumpler CIV, soaring high above the carnage. Their cameras capturing the entire battlefield on glass plates. The cavalry's strategic reconnaissance role, its greatest contribution in 1870, had been made obsolete by a wooden canvas machine. And on the ground, the psychological shock of the charge was broken. The infantryman dug into his hole, armed with his rapid-fire rifle, supported by machine guns and pre-sighted artillery, no longer feared the horse. He saw it as a big, fragile target. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The war ended with the cavalry humbled, its ranks gutted, its purpose questioned. But in the shattered, resource-poor, and tactically innovative post-war Germany of the Reichswehr, a new idea was born. The horse was not discarded, but reconceived. Under the visionary, restrictive terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany could have few tanks or armored cars, so they would make the cavalry modern. The horse became a taxi. The new mobile troops were, in essence, mounted infantry. They would ride to battle on horseback for strategic mobility, but they would dismount to fight. They were equipped with rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The saber was officially relegated to ceremony in 1927. The charge was dead. Long live the trooper. But as a new, aggressive Germany rose in the 1930s, a romantic, atavistic dream still flickered in the hearts of some old generals and the propaganda ministry. They would get one last, catastrophic chance to prove it. On the vast, open plains of an entirely different front, where the distances were great and the enemy, they believed, was primitive. They would send their horsemen into the dawn of the Blitzkrieg and into the heart of a Russian winter. September 1st, 1939, the Blitzkrieg began, and with it, a final, deceptive illusion. In Poland and later in France, German cavalry units did see action. They performed screening duties, pursued broken enemies, and secured vast conquered areas with efficiency. The world saw newsreels of Polish lancers charging German tanks, a powerful myth of suicidal bravery, but largely a fiction. In reality, the German cavalry of the Wehrmacht was already what the Reichswehr had forged: mobile infantry on horseback. They were a logistical tool for an army still largely dependent on the horse. But in the East, against the Soviet Union, the old dream stirred once more. The landscape of the Russian steppe seemed tailor-made for cavalry. Vast, open, with poor roads that turned to bottomless mud in the Rasputitsa, the spring and autumn thaw. Here, mechanized units could bog down. Here, perhaps, the horse could reclaim a measure of its glory. And so, in June 1941, alongside the panzer divisions, rode the 1st Cavalry Brigade. Later expanded into the 24th Panzer Division, a name that itself tells a story of attempted transformation. But other units, like the SS Cavalry Brigade, and later the 8th SS Cavalry Division, Florian Jaeger, retained their horses and their anachronistic pride. In the initial, staggering advances of 1941, these units had their moments. They could traverse the treacherous Pripyat marshes where vehicles could not. They could conduct long-range raids behind Soviet lines, exploiting the chaos, but their mission had darkened. In the brutal war of annihilation on the Eastern Front, cavalry units were often used as mobile security forces. Tasked with pacifying captured territory, a euphemism for a campaign of terror against partisans and civilians, a grim and shameful chapter. But the true reckoning for the horse soldier was not delivered by Soviet infantry alone. It was delivered by the Russian winter, and by a new generation of weapons that made the Mauser 98 look almost quaint. The winter of 1941-42 arrived with a savagery the Germans were utterly unprepared for. Temperatures plunged to degrees Celsius. For the cavalrymen, it was a special kind of hell. Men froze in their saddles. Horses, lacking fodder, died by the tens of thousands, their carcasses lining the roads like grotesque milestones of the failing advance. The romantic image of the steppe rider dissolved into the reality of frost-bitten soldiers huddling against their animals for meager warmth, both slowly dying. And then, the Soviets counterattacked. The Red Army the Germans met in 1942 and beyond was not the disorganized mass of 1941. It was increasingly well-equipped, mobile, and brutally effective. The Soviet soldier was armed with the PPSH-41, a burp gun that could lay down a devastating volume of close-range fire, a nightmare in the villages and forests where cavalry now fought. And everywhere there were T-34s. A cavalryman facing a tank in 1918 was a tragedy. In 1943, it was a commonplace slaughter. The ultimate symbol of this final, feudal anachronism played out during the titanic struggle for Stalingrad. As the German Sixth Army was encircled in the city, a desperate relief attempt was launched, Operation Winter Storm. It was led by armor. But holding the fragile flanks of the German corridor in the frozen, open steppe were units like the Romanian cavalry. They were overrun by Soviet tank armies. The message was clear. In the face of a massed mechanized assault, horsemen stood no chance. But the true, final act was yet to come. In 1944, as the Soviet steamroller advanced, the German High Command, desperately short of fuel and vehicles, made a monstrously nostalgic decision. They would raise new cavalry divisions in a last-ditch effort to plug gaps in the crumbling front. These under-equipped, poorly trained formations were thrown into the path of the Red Army. The result was not battle, it was annihilation. At the Battle of the Korsun-Cherkasy Pocket, German forces, including cavalry units, were surrounded. In a horrific echo of Napoleonic retreats, they attempted a breakout through the snow and mud. Men on foot and on horses were cut down by Soviet guns, their bodies and their dead mounts littering the frozen fields. It was less a military defeat than the brutal punctuation mark on a doomed concept. The war ended. When the dust settled, the statistics told the final story. The German army of World War II, the avatar of Blitzkrieg, had entered the conflict with 750,000 horses. It would use over 2.7 million throughout the war. Over 80% of them died. They were not symbols of martial glory, but beasts of burden, dying by starvation, exhaustion, and shellfire. They were the true, forgotten victims of the cavalry's long, painful demise. The German cavalry was not stopped by a lack of courage, or tradition, or skill. It was rendered obsolete by physics and engineering. The modern rifle created a deadly space no horse could cross quickly enough. The machine gun multiplied that lethality by 100. The tank, the airplane, and the radio then took over the cavalry's core roles of shock, reconnaissance, and exploitation, doing them faster, harder, and with less pity. The age of the horse soldier ended not with a triumphant charge, but with the quiet, mechanical click of a stripper clip being pressed into a rifle, the sputter of a tank engine turning over, and the lonely, freezing silence of the steppe.